my buddy had this weird game about killing orcs and monsters or some shit that I used to watch him play all the time. Years passed, and I forgot all about whatever the hell that game was until like 2 weeks ago, when I rediscovered the best goddamn thing since sliced bread, Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. Since the time when I first played this game as a kid, I've become a huge fan of Arcane Studios, and I had no clue that I had already spent a lot of time with their earlier work until very recently, so I had to pick this game up. And oh my god, I do not regret my decision in the slightest. Today I'm going to talk about the surprising amount of comparisons I saw between Dark Messiah and Arcane's later work on Dishonored, because it really interested me as I was playing through the game. Real quick, there's been a bunch of stuff happening lately with like corrupted hard drives and new computers and shit, so I apologize in advance for any weird aspect ratio changes that may occur over the course of this video. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and just jump into this shit.
Gameplay.
The settings of these two games are wildly different, but the core of these two titles' gameplay is pretty much exactly the same. That core being exploring semi-open environments while taking out your foes however you see fit, using anything from swords to superpowers to lethal bales of hay. Never underestimate the hay bales. The only really notable difference between these games is that Dark Messiah places a much heavier emphasis on combat and Benny Hill-esque physical comedy. And it's not just the overall feel that links these two titles together. What really caught my eye was how even the littlest intricacies of moment-to-moment gameplay were carried over to Dishonored from Dark Messiah. The swordlock battles, climbing up stuff by holding the jump button, the parry system, whipping out your weapons like a supreme fucking badass. Pretty much the entirety of Dishonored's combat system originates from this freaking game, and I didn't even know that shit until like a week ago. Thanks, Dark Messiah! Now there are a few integral differences that set Dark Messiah apart from Dishonored besides the combat-centric approach. I'll start with a very important difference between the two games: the ultimate weapon. One of the greatest weapons in the history of video games. A weapon so overpowered and so easily accessible that it almost renders the entire combat system totally pointless. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I am talking about the boot of Sereth. If you press F in Dark Messiah, everybody dies. So here's how the kick actually works in the game. If you're in the middle of a random room or not near anything context sensitive, the kick will just barely stun an enemy and allow you to get in a hit or two. Semi-useful-ish, and definitely not game-breaking. However, if you are near either a drop-off over 1/4 of an inch or one of the surprisingly consistent spike walls, the enemy's bones will collapse and they'll be rocketed off into fucking space. If you possess even a modicum of precision or patience, the kick might just become the only weapon you use, because it grants instant death and has the added benefit of turning enemies into hilarious floppy meat sacks. One reviewer back in 2006 described Dark Messiah as the adventures of Sir Kekkosonicsyndicate Deathboot in the land of conspicuously placed spike racks, which is derogatory in a way that I'm not really with, but it's also an amazing sentence, and a pretty accurate summation of what the combat can devolve into at some points. So obviously, Arcane removed the kick from Dishonored, for the most part, but you can still see the DNA of the Death Boot in Corvo's Wind Blast power, and the new addition of Blink Assault in Dishonored 2. They nerfed the near-infinite kicking of Dark Messiah by making the ability cost mana, as well as attract enemies to your position, which is much more of a pain in the ass in the stealthy context of Dishonored. Now, I think that still leaves the question of whether or not the Hellish Heel was actually, quote, a good design decision or not. Is it actually game-breaking? Does the kick lessen the quality of the Dark Messiah experience? Fuck no! I can't get enough of that shit! Yeah, shit! Fucking orcs! Fucking goblins! Fucking spiders! Get that shit away! I can't in good conscience call any mechanic that I had a fuck ton of fun with a bad design decision. Sure, it was overpowered, and it could have been and was eventually improved, but I think all it does in the end is add to the fucking absurd charm of Dark Messiah. I can't think of this game without thinking about kicking fools into stuff and kicking stuff into fools, and that's definitely not a bad thing. Another big difference I noticed between the moment-to-moment gameplay of Dark Messiah and Dishonored, which might be tied to how important the kick is to combat, is that using the environment comes into play much more often in Dark Messiah. Early on, the game teaches you, intentionally or not, that Sereth's foot is the actual protagonist of the game and the kick is your new god. This means you're always looking for an opportunity to use the environmentally context-sensitive kick, which leads to the player instinctually scanning the environment for the proper kick positioning. But it's not just conspicuously placed spike racks that you're rewarded with as gory prizes for your keen observational skills. Quite often you can take out a bunch of enemies with one well-placed sword swing or arrowhead. Flimsy construction is an orc's worst enemy, as they say. But wait, there's more! You can also pick up pretty much any random object you see lying around and heave it over your head like a goddamn troglodyte, which actually works surprisingly well. Much like Sereth's Bang & Boot, a barrel build beats sword combat any day of the week. This is the first-person Donkey Kong simulator that I have always wanted. So, much like the kick, throwable objects in Dark Messiah are a bit overpowered, and Arcane took it upon themselves to balance this out and improve it in future products. You can still pick up objects and throw them in Dishonored, but it's much smaller stuff like chloroform bottles and cups and shit. Throwables are still useful and they're still everywhere, but sadly, throwing shit at an enemy's face will no longer knock the fucking soul out of them like it did in good old Stonehelm. Yes, the world of Dark Messiah is one of spiky walls, hefty boxes, and terribly slapped together scaffolding, and it's up to you how, when, and where you take advantage of it. Play your way, as they say. Wait, was that a thing by this point? Do it however you want! Another big part of doing it however you want in these games is the superpowers, which I feel like I have to touch on briefly because they're such an Arcane staple. The powers in Dark Messiah aren't nearly as elaborate or layered as the Dishonored powers, but nearly all of them can serve multiple simple purposes. Not only can you blast people with your fire fingers, you can also throw jars of oil and set them on fire to create traps. Yes, of course you can freeze your enemies with your icy tips, but you can also shoot the ground and lay down a slippery trap that trips up stupid orcs and goblins.
Fucking stupid asshole!
When it really comes down to it, I think one of the biggest differences between Dark Messiah and Dishonored, besides the obvious leanings towards either stealth or combat, is the tone of the gameplay. As I'm sure you can tell by the footage I've shown so far, Dark Messiah is a fucking wacky game. It seems as if it was designed from the ground up simply to entertain, whereas Dishonored is a bit more of a dark, sordid affair throughout. Not that having a darker tone is a bad thing, that crushing pessimism and blood-soaked revenge is part of what makes Dishonored so special. In that same vein, the wackiness of Dark Messiah, the absolute absurdity of rocket-kicking a wizard into low orbit, is no doubt a part of what makes it special. So now that we've covered the gameplay of these two titles, I think it's important that we discuss the one element that every Arcane game has in common, and that is excellent
level design.
Dark Messiah has some things Dishonored doesn't in the gameplay department that make it a different experience, just as engaging in its own way. The same can't really be said for the level design. Now don't get me wrong, Dark Messiah has pretty good level design, and we'll get into what makes it so fun soon, but Dishonored, and especially Dishonored 2's level design, really do blow it out of the fucking water. I already made a whole video on the level design of Dishonored 2, so before this segment I recommend clicking here to watch it. Oh, wait, you can't click on that because YouTube took away annotation. The level design in Dark Messiah is fairly simplistic and blunt when you compare it to Arcane's work on the Dishonored games, but you can see their signature style begin to take shape in some of the larger levels. I think the absolute best instance of this sort of obviousness in level design is something I talked about earlier, which is the environmental interactions. I talked about throwables shifting to more subtle things. We went from barrels to bottles, but it's not that simple. The environment is still really important in Dishonored and can be used in even more ways than in Dark Messiah. It's just that a lot of these uses take more effort in planning and they have more steps. For example, if you want to kill a guard with a wall of light, you first have to rewire the wall of light and then you gotta find a way to push the guards into it or something like that. You gotta lure guards under a speaker with a throwable or an arrow or something, and then you gotta drop the speaker on them from a distance, so on and so on. In Dark Messiah, see barrel, throw barrel. Spike wall, must kick! On ledge, must kick! Do you see what I'm getting at here? A lot of the environmental interactions in Dishonored are more complicated in both setup and execution. The design work has just grown and become more elaborate and complicated. Not to say there aren't moments of simple environmental wackiness in Dishonored. There is still a bit of that in there. And it's still in there because they know it was fucking fun in Dark Messiah. The simplicity of the level design and the environmental interactions and all that shit isn't a bad thing. Sometimes simple stuff is just as fun as really complex stuff. Another instance in which the level design evolved from DM to DS, one of the best parts of Dishonored 2 is how it adds gimmicks to its gameplay every time you come to a new level. Witches, clockwork soldiers, time travel, shit gets fucking weird. Dark Messiah never goes as far as Dishonored when it comes to crazy left turns into weird, innovative gimmicks, but there are things that litter the levels that change up the pace from the normal hack and slash. These brief gimmicks range from outrunning a giant giant worm, to partaking in an honorable duel to the death against an orc tribe leader, to simply crafting a little sword in a furnace with materials you've come across in your travels. These moments never become much more than little flourishes on top of the main experience in Dark Messiah, but I believe it foreshadows the larger changes in pace that the Dishonored games eventually got down to a fucking science. Let's pull back for a moment and look at the larger picture instead though. What are the most significant improvements in level design from Dark Messiah to Dishonored? Well, I've been saying it for the past few minutes, but I'm gonna sum it up right here. Dishonored's level design is both more elaborate and more concise than Dark Messiah's. Basically, it's similar, but also way better. All three of these games follow the formula of moving through a series of elaborate freeform arenas, where you see a bunch of dudes and you murder them or, quote, put them to sleep, however you like. Playing Dark Messiah took me back to a time when that formula was less refined, and it only helped clarify how much better of a job Dishonored does of both giving the player multiple paths towards their objective and properly pointing the player to where they need to go, using environmental cues and lighting and building design and all that shit. Dark Messiah is way more linear than Dishonored. Corvo and Emily's journeys have exponentially more locational options and routes to take when progressing through their games, and yet Dark Messiah is the game I got lost in because of repeating textures and the occasionally mundane and corridor-heavy areas, especially in the late game. Shit gets confusing real fast when everything's really huge and looks exactly the fucking same. This rarely happens in Dishonored 1 and 2, as all of the arenas look and feel unique enough for you to always easily get your bearings. But aside from a few small issues like that, the level design of Dark Messiah really does stand the test of time, and offers a nice little peek into the early iterations of the games we're playing right now. Speaking of early iterations of things and stuff, and I don't care about making a segue, so let's talk about the story.
Story.
Dark Messiah of Might and Magic's story is goddamn ridiculous. I mean, so is Dishonored's, but Dark Messiah revels in that shit. Everyone talks as if they're trying to out-monologue their co-stars. Which wizard can say words the most impressively? Is it the mighty Finrig? Or the devious Erin here? What about Minileg? I'm sorry, the only reason I'm talking like that is because everybody in this game is hamming this shit up like a Thanksgiving dinner.
Tomorrow we sail with it, and careful with that soup there.
And you know what? I love it! I genuinely enjoy the voice acting more in Dark Messiah than I do in Dishonored 2.
Anton Sokolov made this lock.
Shut up. I can't say the voice acting in Dark Messiah is better than Dishonored 1, though. I still feel like the original Dishonored is the peak of Arkane's storytelling and world building so far. Dishonored overall is much more polished and engaging from top to bottom, and in advance, if you haven't played the game, you're not gonna get that kind of intensity from Dark Messiah. It's more of a classic romping fantasy adventure, kill all the orcs, Sereth kind of thing.
Sir, wake up! The manor is under attack! There are necromancers everywhere!
Either way, the voice acting and tone of these three games may be different, but the actual delivery of the story, the way the player is fed information, is pretty much exactly the same. Like in Dishonored, most of the cutscenes in Dark Messiah take place in first person, with you watching the action unfold through the protagonist's eyes, right before the experience seamlessly morphs from cutscene to gameplay. Like many aspects of Dark Messiah, the cutscenes were so immersive that Arkane just carried it over wholesale to their future products. There's even a fucking boat conversation in Dark Messiah, which made me laugh. An early indicator of Arkane's fetish for small wooden skiffs. It's like a Tarantino feet thing at this point. There's also notes littered around the levels of Dark Messiah, just like Dishonored, but they're not nearly as elaborate, well-written, or consistent in how often they show up, so they don't really matter as much. Something that does set Might and Magic apart from Dishonored is the fact that it occasionally includes actual CG cutscenes that I could never take seriously because they look like a fucking Bionicles TV movie. I can see why they stopped doing this. Even so, in my eyes, these rock'em sock'em robot looking ass cutscenes only add to the charm of this ridiculous game. Another thing that added an extra spice of charm to the late game of Might and Magic was some moral decision making, which was a surprise as most of the decision making happens like over halfway through the game. I wasn't even aware of that part of Dark Messiah, so it was fun to take part in, even if there were really only two main decisions. Decision 1, team up with the wholesome wizard prodigy or the demonic big-titted succubus who just wants to murder people and suck dicks. Decision 2, blow up the world with Satan or don't. So, you know, pretty pretty broad stuff. The decision-making in Dark Messiah isn't nearly as elaborate as it is in Dishonored, but the early seeds of the mechanics are there, especially when you're given the opportunity to do something in-game and out of nowhere, like murder the main love interest. And then she comes back later as a lich, and you get to kill her again, and it's great! I'm not gonna go into how exactly Dishonored's moral decision-making has evolved over time, because that is a whole video unto itself. So I think I'm just gonna cut this bit off here and start wrapping things up.
In conclusion,
I am very glad I played Dark Messiah. As a huge fan of Arcane's work, besides Prey, let's not talk about Prey too much, it was really cool to see the origins of the mechanics that I've come to love so much in Dishonored. Dark Messiah was created in a simpler time, and you can see that reflected in the game design. But that does not make it bad or mean that it's aged poorly. Quite the opposite. Dark Messiah holds up like a motherfucker today, and established a rock-solid foundation for Arcane to build upon when creating Dishonored. Go play this game. You will have a hell of a time.